Welcome to One Book, readers discussing one book in their lives. Today it's a little later today in Izmir, Turkey, and early morning. Thank you so much for getting up, but early morning in Southern California. Today we'll be talking about The Halloween Tree, published in 1972 by Ray Bradbury and Annie. You're a writer and educator, and I'm so excited that you're taking some time to talk about The Halloween Tree, an often, I think, overlooked book in general, but also around the subject of Halloween. And at one point, there is the group of boys who are on this long journey through the history of even more than Halloween, this history of this strange time where the sun starts to descend. One of the boys says, "What does it mean to celebrate?" And that's a theme going in the work. And I want to thank you because this conversation for me is really a celebration. It's kicking off Halloween for me, and really a great time to examine the work during this ancient time where the veils are thin between the worlds. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a celebration for me too. It's a book that is it's so important to me in so many different layers, and to get to share that with you and to be kicking off Halloween officially. Although I think my apartment has been decorated since September, the top of September.
Yeah, and we need these Halloween celebrations a lot this year because I don't know, some places may not be trick or treating, may be canceled, or I don't. I hope people will take a moment and think about reading this book because I found rereading it, I should say, beautiful cover, great illustrations. I found rereading it just a real celebration of language, of creativity. I've often seen of this time as the holiday of the imagination. I don't know where to start because there's so much we can start with and continue with. But I guess I want to start with asking you a question. And the question I'll ask you, Annie, is this time through the book, how did it sound to you?
Oh, it sounds.
How does it sound?
It resonates. It more than sounds now. It resonates. I was reflecting on how it shaped. When we read it back in college, if you had
Mm-hmm.
asked me, is this a book that shaped you as a young person, I probably would have said something like this way. Probably shaped me a lot more. And in so
Hmm.
many ways, Mr. Dark was one of the first villains that I really had a crush on as a kid. I was, especially when Jonathan Pryce played him, but even in the book, I just was enchanted by him
Right.
for whatever reason. And this one really grabbed me more when we read it as a class in college, and you and I and Paul
Mm-hmm.
taught it. We latched onto things within it that touched my soul as a writer, as a poet, as a dreamer. And it absolutely sounds still. And that's what's so cool about this. I remember reading this, I was 20 when we taught this book.
Mm-hmm.
And it touched me in so many important ways. And now looking back at 34 and seeing the way my writing has been deeply affected by this book in particular, it really was a magnificent experience to reread it and to find so much poetry within Bradbury and so much evocative imagery and delight. Like you
Yes.
said, pure celebration. This
Yes.
book is a celebration of Halloween, of friendship, of the human spirit, of
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
It's an amazing book.
Yeah, and we're referring to, for people who haven't read it, the wonderfully named Mound Shroud. He explains the name to these young boys who start out their Halloween in a normal fashion, but it like the perfect Halloween goes into an adventure that is life changing, and Mound Shroud is the guide. And wow, I mean, you said it so perfectly about language because so many times you are impressed with the joy and the precision of his writing. I think there's one time where he says there was one character who's dressed as Death. You know, that's his costume, and he drops the Sith on the ground, and the boy does, and he writes the Sith lay on the grass like a lost smile.
Yeah,
There's so many areas, and another point he talks about. They were watching all the chaos unfold over Europe during the witch craze, and
yes,
they were saying we should frighten the frighteners, and we should scare the scarers, and we should shiver the
Yes.
shiverers. Yeah, and it's just page after page of just beautiful writing and very precise, and a writing that embraces nature. And
Yeah.
that's one of the great themes of the book. You know, they have this 50s, early 60s suburban Midwest uh, town, maybe something you'd seen like Back to the Future or something, a little town. But the adventure begins when they move beyond, they move in toward the ravine, and they move into this liminal zone, and you start to see the language starts taking on elements of nature beyond quote unquote civilization, and that's when their guide Moundshroud takes them into this adventure, going through the history of not just Halloween, but this time at the end of the harvest, the time that the days are getting shorter, the sun is disappearing. He says the sun is being murdered when they visit ancient Egypt, and humanity is waiting for the return of the light.
Which is a theme that's been so important, in so many books. Even looking at something like Gawain and the Green Knight, where we're dealing with the return of the light and that celebration and the end of all things that gives birth to what is to come next. And what I love about this book is not only the way that it different eras into just this fanciful, wonderful way, but the way that it tackles very real fears for children, but also for adults right now, especially where we're dealing with being isolated from the people we love, where we're dealing with so much uncertainty. Will the sun ever rise again? Will we ever go back to what was normal before it started? There's that fear that it isn't going to rise again. We are forever in the dark. And this book is showing us ways of dealing with that from that childlike innocence perspective of I'm going to embrace the fear and I'm going to explore what that means to me. And I'm going to look forward to it, not maybe the same sun rise again tomorrow, but the sun will rise. And what are we willing to give up? What are we willing to what are we willing to do in order to bring the sun back? And that's what this book really is. You see these children, these 8 boys who are going along with Moundshroud, who's heavily intimated to be death.
Right.
They're willing to travel with death through these fantastic eras, and they're terrified.
Yeah.
We see Tom shaking the Tom, who's dressed as a skeleton. He's kind of not exactly our main character, but it's about as close to a main character as we get.
Right.
The boy is sort of this collective character. But we see Tom in his bones, as it keeps saying, shaking, terrified. The boys scream, they shriek, they whimper. They're terrified throughout this book as they're pursuing their lost friend through these different eras, but they never once falter. They might for a moment hesitate, but they never try to turn away or to turn back. And that is so inspiring right now. And I think speaking as a mother, it's a book that I feel is inspiring for kids to show them a way of dealing with fear and with loss in this fantastic Halloween way. We celebrate the dead. We celebrate our fears so that they're less frightening.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you brought up Pipkin, who is the boy who they're trying to track down and rescue and find. He joins them late at the Halloween tree, which we have to talk about the actual tree because it's so beautiful. But he ends up getting whisked away into the land of the undiscovered, and they are in pursuit of him. And I love that you brought up the collaborative nature, that these quests are never about just ourselves being able to do it or not do it, but it's the reliance on others, and that the guides are present. Moundshroud is a guide. It is revealed later he's more than that, but he's ultimately a guide on this adventure, and sometimes not an easy one. Not just a cheerleader, but a guide who's going to put him in situations that they have to overcome. And I think what's amazing about the Pipkin imagery that I was thinking about today is he's described so beautifully by Ray Bradbury as the perfect boy.
Yes,
he's like the young Apollo or the sun or Mithras or Jesus Christ. He is in the ancient stories the carrier of all the kind of hopes of humanity in this mythic archetypal sense. And to see him right away weak, it's almost like the Christ wound he has, where he's when they first encounter him, and he's not the same. it shows that this shining light is, it's not going to be a normal night when they have find out that he, after such a description of being the almost like the young green man, you know, vibrant, vital, full of life. And that can be a symbol of a dream we have. It can be a symbol of what we thought of our lives are. It can be a symbol of humanity. It's a very powerful how it's constructed. And then these quote unquote lesser boys or the followers, or that's too strong, but you know, they're not placed on the same kind of symbolic pedestal. They're the ones who are going to go on this journey. And it's an educational journey as much as a courageous journey, and an education into humanity, humanity's fears, humanity's follies, and the very real thing that this is a time where we remember the dead, or some cultures don't. I think Tom Skelton, who you mentioned, who's dressed as the skeleton, at one point he's shocked because I think they're in Mexico, and he's looking down at the Day of the Dead, and he's thinking, no one remembers our dead, you know, in our culture. No one's at the graves. No one's bringing them food. Yeah, yeah. So this remembrance that they're not only trying to salvage the future in their friend, but they're starting to remember all the dark nights. And Bradbury, oh, your daughter's behind you, so cute. Ray Bradbury talks about this is every night. It's been every night for thousands of years when we wonder if we'll wake up for the sun. So
Yes, and I love the way that he shows that across cultures and just the way that he deals, you know, and it's not necessarily an exact rendering of these historical cultures. It's
right,
very much a condensed, childlike, fanciful version of this. But he's showing the way that it's a universal fear, and I think that's the point for him, rather than to be super accurate, to
right,
show it's universal. It began with the caveman. It crosses through into Egyptian history. We go to the British Isles. We go to Mexico. We come back to home where the boys are worrying about their friend.
yeah,
And by showing that it's part of the universal experience to have that fear of the unknown, to deal with death in one way or another, and that it's okay to say our culture doesn't deal with death perhaps in the way that we should. I'm going to learn from these other cultures to honor death in a different way.
mm-hmm.
I'm going to look at traditions that I follow. One of the boys at one point dressed up as a ghost. They're watching they're on the Greek islands, and they're watching the people leave out food for the dead.
Yeah,
He dressed up as a ghost, and he says, "Is this why I'm dressed up as a ghost? Because of this sort of thing?" And one of the other ones, you know, is touching his mask, going, "And why am I dressed up like this?"
yes,
And the fact, so without question, they put on their costumes. For them, it was just a very surface level appreciation of Halloween. And Bradbury is taking us deeper and saying,
mm-hmm.
even if I'm not going to give you all the answers in this book, I'm going to show you the way to start questioning. And I think that's one of the things that made this book so important to me, because it's very easy with a lot of books just to accept, you know, the author is trying to give us their perspective, to give us an answer. This is the interpretation that we have. And we talked a little bit about that, you and I, with an academic. There is an interpretation of a book.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't land on that same interpretation, it can be intimidating to try to come up with something new. And a lot of writers feel like we have to have this authority, whether we're crafting fiction or nonfiction. We have to speak from this place of authority. And this book helped me to loosen up a little bit, because I can be a bit high strung with my writing, where, you know, I'm just finishing the proof of my horror fantasy novel that I've been working on for on and off for 7 years.
Wow.
And these little loose ends that I was having to go back and go, well, I have to explain exactly and how does magic work in this world, or what about the villain's motivation if we looked at it, and just too many layers, where it was taking the joy out of the writing for me. And rereading this helped me actually to remember, as I was doing my final proofread, that it's okay to leave some things open. It's okay to invite the reader to engage, to interpret, to question. And Bradbury really does that. We have this one wonderful moment where the boy who's dressed up as a beggar, they see the Irish beggars going down a road to knock on doors, and he goes, "Let's go that way." But they don't have time. They have to go to Mexico. They have to go to Pep. Yeah. And that's open for us to interpret. You know, what happens down that road? Yeah. What is the significance of this boy's costume and of his path that we don't get to explore? And I love that Bradbury was brave enough to leave us with those questions at the end of the book. And how often is it with a movie that when we leave and we have questions that we want to talk about with our friends, those tend to be the movies that we go back to again and again and again to reinterpret, to reevaluate. And this book gives us that possibility, not tied up at the end of the day with this very neat ribbon. There's wonderful questions, wonderful lyricism throughout it that
Yeah.
you want to go back. Nothing is it's not a concrete book. It,
No.
it reads like prose poetry, and poetry so much more often than fiction what invites us in with the questions of interpretation. What does this really mean? This book means to me something very different than it would mean to you, than it's meaning to my 5-year-old as I'm reading to her this Halloween.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that point, because I think, you know, some people limit the book, and maybe even when they were trying to sell the book, they did this in terms of, this is a telling of how we, came to celebrate Halloween from Samhain or All Hallows Eve. But it's a much it goes much further back, number one, but also it's a much more thematic story about coming to consciousness. Just like when you talked about the young boys coming to consciousness of what is in their costume, it's also about coming to consciousness with death and life, and this part of the year, that is when much of the hemisphere is dying, and that ancient fear of would the sun come back, and how many millions of people encounter fear and wondering if the sun will come back, and that sense of they emerge brave because they went through this realization of consciousness of what life is, not because they got certain answers.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I remember one of the criticisms when we taught this book was that people couldn't quite grasp the imagination that Bradbury was bringing to some of these events, showing the Egyptian experience, showing the British Isles experience. People sort of railed against, well, that's not exactly how it went, and that sort of thing. But we're being invited to see this from the perspective of these children, not from the perspective of historians or with perfect accuracy. And the children are really encountering it through, it's almost like a Halloween House version of Egyptian history or a version of Saturday, where it's supposed to be fanciful, over the top, frightening, and delightful all at once. And Bradbury, I think, really does a great job of showing those conflicting emotions of terror and joy, of the fear of the unknown and the hope for what is next. These boys, at every step of this journey, I mean, they are children. They're supposed to be out trick or treating, having fun. Instead, they're swept up by Mountroud on this kite made of torn up animal posters from a circus, and traveling thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They go even further back than that. And in each of these stations that they go to, their friend, as you mentioned, Pip, is somehow trapped in there. He's in mummy wrapping world. He's a dog in British Isles, and he's a gargoyle at one point. And they're trying to save him. And rather than being caught up on, wait a minute, guys, there was something in that candy because this doesn't make sense. This doesn't happen. They go with that experience. They go with the imagination. I think that's something that this book can teach us sometimes, rather than coming from that place of really strict questions what we're reading, to embrace it for the journey, embrace it for the joy that it gives us, and to find the poetry within it and the magic, rather than simply the fear or the I don't know, the really being so wed to reality they so often are.
Right. It's not meant to be an informative thesis. There's some great books about the history of Halloween, but it's meant to be it's meant to mimic or invite an experience of consciousness. And as the powerful thing is, as he's doing it through these boys and as a group, so you saw these kind of multiple perspectives, the questions they're asking, the things they're noticing, how they're reacting to these different epochs that they're going through. The reader's invited to go through the same level of understanding about how people come to celebrate and remember and appreciate the people who have come before us, who are lost to us now, and the real, what it really, he's trying to get at what it really means for the sun, that it may not come back.
Well,
and then it does, which is later in the year.
Isn't it at Halloween that we all suddenly get interested in these things?
Yes.
When reading tarot for people, or the people are asking me what's going on astrologically. My engagement gets such an uptick during the Halloween season.
Yeah.
And it is because we are getting to that place of the leaves are turning color, and it's beautiful, but then they start to fall, and we're left with the bare branches. We're left with the shortened hours. We're left with wondering, will the sun come back? Will warmth return? And I mean, that might sound silly coming from Southern California where it's always warm.
Right.
But for us, it's in the 60s
Yeah.
and we're freezing.
Yeah.
We get to that point of starting to go inward. Bradbury does this beautiful thing where he's talking about when you have fire, when you have warmth, when you have stability, you have the luxury of not living from moment to moment. You have the luxury of turning inward and having memory. And he said to the cavemen, those memories were like ghosts because they didn't understand the concept of memory. Suddenly these things would come rising up in their dreams. They were sitting around the fire and they would literally think that they were ghosts when really just their memories. And I think during this era, during this season, we have a similar fascination with reflecting because we're inside. We're not doing as much, especially this season, more so than past seasons, perhaps.
Yes.
And so we'll have people who they want to know. They want to. The veil is thinning right now. We're closer to the spiritual world than we are most points of the year. And right now, people are feeling that. They're feeling their own veil pulled back, and they're wanting to look deeper, wanting to see, why am I going through this? What is the significance of this? And sometimes in order to do that, we have to go back and look at what did our ancestors go through? What's our world gone through? And this book really, by showing these children going through that on such an epic level and in such a very palpable, tangible way, it's inviting us to do the same, to go back and, during this time and, the sun is low, so to speak. Yeah. And when the veil is thin and we can connect to our higher selves, to the past selves that we have, it's inviting us to do that, to say, don't be afraid, look inward, connect with that self, connect with those past lives, and see where it leads, see what you discover about why you're a witch in this life. Why are you wearing that witch costume for Halloween? Well, here's some things you can know.
Yeah.
And I love that about this book.
Yeah, and it's great because he does the almost idyllic 12-year-old Midwestern group of boys getting ready for Halloween. But we all do that. At this time of the year, we all have these adventures, whether it's wild costume parties in college or, I watch the movie Halloween every year. We're all kind of donning these costumes at this time or rituals at this time. And this book is inviting you to explore what those mean, to make things conscious and to bring that light of understanding of how it relates to yourself as a human in this life, especially at this season. In a similar way, we'll have to have you on to do a solstice episode with another book, but that would be interesting. But at this time, when the sun is visibly the days are getting shorter, and he talks about lesson number 1 for Halloween, Osiris, the god who is the Egyptian god who is dismembered, but does he return? And then so there's this. It's a very sly trick, because with these 12-year-old boys putting on their costumes, and they're almost cliche costumes, but we all do that at this time, whether it's decorate a house or you're going to trick or treat, and these are all resonances from an ancient time that's been passed down to us, and this book invites you and explores how to make those conscious to the level that ultimately arises when he says night and day, summer and winter, life and death, noon and midnight, racing through thousands of years of death and night. That's one of the things you can realize, along with what you said about not being alone. So I just thought that was great how you brought up that the move toward consciousness, toward warmth.
Well, and he shows how ritual evolves. We see when he shows the Roman soldiers come in and they chop down the Druid oaks.
Oh,
and the Druids, they fall down dead. Samhain falls down dead with this. They set up so the Romans then set up their golden idols to their gods. But then we see as the star rises and the 3 wise men come into the scene, the gold from those idols melts into the Virgin Mary and statues of Jesus.
Yes.
And so it's showing us that, and there's a wonderful passage that he has in there about this turns to this, turns to that, and pointedly showing us that even as the name changes, even as your
Yes.
ritual evolves, as a kid,
Yes.
your costume and your grease paint.
Right.
Now you're watching your favorite scary movie. You're taking your kid trick or treating and reading books
Right.
that weren't
Right.
you. Those rituals are still with us, and it's the so much of magic is intention, right? And that's what he's showing us. The intention is still there, the belief is still there, and even across cultures, whether it's Osiris, whether it's the cavemen, whether it's this with the sugar skulls in Mexico, we're honoring the dead in these very intentional ritual ways that at the heart are all the same. Firstly, they have very different trappings, but at the heart they are the same thing. And that's, I think, especially right now where we feel so isolated,
Yeah.
to see that at the heart we are all the same, and then finding these ways of connecting, whether it's through a book, whether it's through the shared experience of what we're all going through, to show that yes, the surface is very different. Obviously, we have huge cultural differences, from one culture to the next, but at the heart, we have the same emotion, we have the same, that just the same soul.
Yeah. We're all huddled in the dark. But
Exactly.
I love that scene in Mexico when they come across the what's the word I'm looking for, Annie? But the not the dealer, but he's the seller of the
The
sweet
sugar skull.
skulls. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's a seller of the sweet sugar skulls, and then they each get one with their own name on it. Yeah.
And then a boy comes up from Mexico and
Hmm.
looks kind of like them, but not quite.
Right.
Bradbury describes him as just being, hey, that boy has my name
Right.
and looks a lot like me. And they
Hmm.
come and they steal the skulls from our boys because they're
Yep.
theirs. And it's
Yep.
showing that their mirror image exists within this other culture. There are
Yeah.
still these boys. And there's a great line in the beginning of the book about it's Halloween and there were boys in the town.
Yeah.
And it's this paradigm of what a boy is to Bradbury. And we
Yeah.
see that across the culture. These boys exist in all of the culture.
And so many great lines are literally a celebration of not only beautiful language but of this time. There's that other great part where I think is in Mexico as well, where he talks about the graveyard was like the village, but the
Yes.
village had become a graveyard because
Yes.
during this time of remembrance, of fear, of getting ready for the descent as we move into winter, and the days get shorter, this is a time where the villagers were going to the graveyard and setting up food for those people who had passed. And that prompts that great realization that how do we don't, no one's visiting the graveyards in our town at this time. No one's feeding the dead
Yes.
the memory. And it's really a powerful because it talks about this long, almost epoch long interconnection, not just the connection of people who are maybe living with us in different cultures right now, but this long, long tradition of when you think about all the people who had to survive the nights that lead up to you being here, about to about to take your daughter trick or treating again. I mean, it's this sense that we're still here, and at that moment to be able to take this journey of the end of the year, of the sun getting shorter, we're still here to do that. And
Yeah.
that's ultimately what it's a celebration of. Even as fearful we can be of the night, this moment that we're still here, and let's take with us the people who aren't, because we're lucky to be able to do that.
And don't we get to do that with our writing as writers, right?
Mm-hmm.
We get to, I could say write a few more times. But to forever honor the things that matter to us, the themes, the people, even if it's not necessarily writing a story about your grandmother where it's actually your
Mm-hmm.
grandmother, but you're taking traits from her, you're taking lessons that she taught you, you're incorporating that into what you're doing. Our way of honoring the dead and of honoring the living as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wanted to talk about something that really jumped out at me. I mean, it sounds kind of foolish because the book is called The Halloween Tree. So, of course, I don't want to say that, oh, I just noticed the Halloween tree. But my fiance and I recently read a book on tree bathing. It's written by a doctor. And so we spend a lot of time when we're together in Russia, in nature. And Russia has these incredible forests, these birch tree forests, and these immense pines. And so this kind of doctor has written his ideas of tree bathing about how you can, a meditative, but also a healthy approach to being outside, away from noise, away from pollution. So you can think about it that way. And so I was thinking of titling this discussion Halloween Tree Bathing, because when I came across this time and the description, the writing about the Halloween tree that's behind this haunted house, quote unquote haunted house, and there's thousands of pumpkins that are swinging in the branches, and each one's different, and they come to light, and it's alive. It really made me aware in the sense of tree bathing, but for Halloween tree bathing, it made me so much aware of how much we need nature right now, and how much we're starving for language as well
Yeah.
in this beautifully crafted way that takes time and intentionality and is practiced at the highest art. Because we're stuck behind screens, we're reading all kinds of stuff, seeing all kinds of stuff. But literally, when I came across this description of the Halloween tree this time, it really hit me hard in terms of what we're lacking right now. So I'm wondering if you had a similar experience, or maybe another part hit you really hard based on where we are, more isolated, more uncertain in this world at the moment.
I had a couple of. One of them, actually, the page that I had open that I wanted to read a section of is the description of the Halloween tree. If it's okay for me to
Yeah,
read
go
it.
ahead, please.
So it's the pumpkins begin to come alive, and we've seen this tree that's bedecked with all of these wonderfully carved pumpkins. One by one, starting at the bottom of the tree and the nearest pumpkins, candles took fire within the raw interiors. This and then that, and this, and then still another, and on up and around. 3 pumpkins here, 7 pumpkins still higher, a dozen clustered beyond, 100, 500, 1,000 pumpkins lit their candles, which is to say, brightened up their faces, showed fire in their square or round or curiously slanted eyes, flame guttered in their toothed mouths, sparks leaked out their ripe cut ears. Just that description of this tree. It's this terribly tall, frightening tree hung with these pumpkins. It becomes magic as these pumpkins magically spring to life within them. The flames come alight without anybody doing anything of their own accord, and it does give you this sense of connecting to something that is deeper, because it's nature for one, and we always find a connection in nature. We can always find that sort of transcendental connection to the higher power by going out and putting our feet in the grass and putting our hands up to the sky. But here it's even deeper, because as these pumpkins, which could not be hanging from this tree, nobody put them there that we know of. The fact that light on their own, and we see later in the book, towards the end, when the boys are going to bed, we see each pumpkin is carved with the face of one of the boys, also in their costume.
Yeah, and all the pumpkin faces are unique. Not only the 7 that were the boys, but each one they aren't different. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's this idea that we are all tied together through this. It's like a Grazel, like the world tree. We're tied together.
Yes.
Mystical magic, mystical natural force, and we do need that right now. And for so many people, I mean, you can see my wall of plants behind me in my apartment, living in a city.
Yeah.
And we have great lawns, great parks, all that sort of stuff, but it's not something that's ours. So just having houseplants in the apartment, an abundance of houseplants, makes me feel, especially right now, more connected. For a while we had our trails closed, we couldn't go down to the beaches, anything like that, and that was difficult to feel cut off. And these boys living in this very idyllic town, but they still are they're going outside of the town. They go to the ravine, they've gone trick-or-treating, they've gotten all their candy, go down to the ravine, the most haunted house. Bradbury describes it as the haunted house. The Halloween.
Right.
And they go down there into this wild place to connect with nature, to connect with the magic that's within themselves. So that aspect absolutely stood out to me, especially right now, the idea that we need nature. We also need each other. And this book it's one of the things I love about the writing style here. The lyricism. The lyricism, for my own writing, I struggled so much when I was in college with how do I separate my fiction from my poetry. And this was one of the books that reminded me in my 20s, so not as a young child, but as a young woman, this reminded me I don't have to separate the two. I can have that more flowering, lyrical language, and that's okay. And that really has shaped so much of his almost surrealism. He gets so poetic in his writing. that really has shaped the way that I approach my own fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that really grabbed me with this is the idea of these boys. They are not concrete individuals. We don't have these really well-defined characters. Instead, we have the collective of the boys. And when you talk about the boys, you know them. They are very, as a group, they are very well defined. And by the end of it, when they're going to save Pip, Mountsha asks them, he says, make a bargain with me and with all of the spirits here. A year of your life for Pip. And at first they're like, oh yeah, no problem. And he goes, no, really think of it. For some of you, that will mean dying at 58 instead of 59.
Right.
For rest of you, 86 instead of 87. And although that may seem like a long time, the difference between 44 and 45 is maybe not so big. And when and he even mentions, Bradbury says, at some point they would look back on that decision with doubt. But in the moment, after they think for just a few seconds, they all say, yes, we will give a year of our life for our friends. Because for them, that sacrifice to be able to be whole with their group. And I wonder how many of us would give a year of our life to be able to connect with the people that we love, the people who we're separated from right now, the places that we love, to be able to go into nature, to be able to go with our friends into nature, and to reconnect on that level. I think Bradbury really does a wonderful job, and it's very timely, of pointing out how valued our connection with ourselves needs to be, but also how valued our connections with others need to be.
Yeah, and I think it expands even more when you talk about, the image of Pip as he's presented early as, the perfect boy. He can be the higher self, or it could be the dream, or some aspect of our life. What will we give up to try to save that? So it's not necessary. It can all work within an archetypal sense of one human being, as they're moving forward. But I'm really glad you brought up the house, because I don't know if I noticed this when I first read it. Well, of course, I think I noticed it, but it didn't stick with me as much. But the Jacob Marley knocker.
Yes.
From Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And it places this book in that kind of tradition as a writer of using holidays to celebrate this, participating in this longer tradition of fear and loss and suffering that life is, and using this as a meditation on coming to consciousness in a way. And I think, if you don't mind, I don't know if you're a fan of it, but if you are, I would love to have you on around Christmas to talk about the Christmas Carol. Because that is the one book I want to do. But and then the last thing I want to just quote before you can finish it up for us with any thoughts you have. But toward the very end, Tom asks Moundshroud, he says, Mr. Moundshroud, will we ever stop being afraid of nights and death? And Moundshroud says to him, when you reach the stars, yes. And so it's this notion of the stars, it becomes a mystical experience, or when we pass on and move on into another world, or when we reach this consciousness. This would be used a lot in poetry about understanding, in a Buddhist way, the non-separation. So it's a fascinating book, because it is a meditation on death at a time where death is very present to our ancestors, when the nights were getting longer, and the wondering if Osiris would come back. And they say that the sun dies every night, has to be reborn. So it's really really. I hope people will reread it, and they'll encounter a lot of beauty in the language that I think we need, a connection to a journey that we need, and just a really well-crafted, joyful manuscript, even though it's dealing with very powerful themes.
It is joyful, and that final meditation there about when you reach the stars. I think that's something that, again, coming from that spiritual background with tarot and astrology,
right.
We find a comfort in our rituals, in the stars, in what the cards say. What does the pendulum say about this? We find comfort in the idea that there is this greater power at work. And when we look back and we can see our ancestors had the same fears and the same questions that we do now, what we're struggling with this pandemic, that others struggled with past pandemics and other periods of isolation, it makes us feel less afraid. So when we think about the stars as this universal interconnected force that joins all of us, there's suddenly solidarity, people that we don't know, never know, and it's very comforting. And I think he provides us with that, and he provides us with a way into these deeper things through his imagination, through his lyricism, and two of my other favorite authors are Stephen King again, and they have that same, and Lovecraft also is up there with me, and all three of them have this wonderful sense of imagination in their language where you see sort of that surreal, magical playfulness even when they're dealing with very serious things. Yeah. King in the Dark Tower at one point introduces himself as a character. And I don't think there are many authors who could have pulled that off to literally put themselves into their own book as a player. And when he does that, it's so just it's asking us to suspend our disbelief, right? And I think that's what Bradbury and Gaiman and Lovecraft all ask us to do. And they do it in a way where they are a guide, they are a mound shroud. They're facilitating transition from, and it's not escapism. It's not escapism at all. It's transitioning to a different perspective that when we come back from the book into the real world, we have a new way of looking at the world that takes that fear away, that gives us that sense of joy and that sense of delight.
Yeah, that journey to consciousness. And I really liked how you talked about writing as the offering to the dead. Feeding the dead, not forgetting the dead, and to help aid the living as a guide. I mean, it's a beautiful description of writing. And with that, I want to congratulate you on, well, I hope I don't jinx it, because you said you had a little more to do, but on finishing your novel. And I'd love to have you back on just to talk about the novel. But please, on your calendar, circle somewhere around the solstice, and we'll do one book Christmas Carol, if you're up for it. That would be, because I really this reading really, I hadn't thought about that as much before, about how it relates to that book, as I did reading it this time. It really jumped out at me. The Jacob Marley Doorknocker really jumped out at me.
It did me too, and just the way that the children understood it right away, and they knew the significance. So yeah, I think that I would love to read that one.
Yeah. I think one of the children says, "Oh, that's the guy who wanders the earth or something." The doomed. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, happy Halloween. Have a great time with your daughter. What is there going to be her costume this year? Has she selected?
She's going to be a witch. She would do the boys proud.
Of course. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, we'll talk to you soon. And thank you so much for taking some time to talk about this, underappreciated novel. And I hope more people read it, especially now.
Yes, I do as well. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and best of luck on finishing up the novel for publication.
Thank you very much.